The next few weeks and months will be critical for both the Harris and Trump campaigns, as we are now less than 100 days from the U.S. presidential election. As some believe, we have moved from a potential coronation to a race. Joining us with a look at what he's watching is Chris Krueger, Managing Director of the TD Cowen Washington Group, also a macro trade, fiscal and policy analyst. Chris, great to have you with us. I want to, if I could, talk a little bit about the cut and thrust of politics at the beginning, and then we'll get into the policy side in a second. But you highlighted in a note that you put out, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that we saw a strong start for Kamala Harris. She opened with a campaign video, Freedom, endorsed obviously by Beyonce, giving making sure that was okay with them, and a very quick raise of $200 million. Can you characterize maybe what this means and what we should be taking from that?
Well, it's great to be with you, Kim. I mean, it's pretty much unprecedented. I mean, the big narrative going, just 10 days ago was the massive enthusiasm gap between the two campaigns, the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign, particularly post-assassination attempt of former President Trump. And now what you've seen with Harris being the presumptive nominee is that enthusiasm chasm has basically been eliminated. You now for the first time have Democratic base voters enthusiastic about voting. You've seen record fundraising numbers. You've seen record these record Zoom calls where you're getting participation, volunteer signups in a lot of the states that at one point, in sort of the weeks after that historic June debate, you had Democrats pretty much across the board in panic. States like Maine and New Mexico looked like they might be in play. The House candidates down ballot, the Senate candidates down ballot, really concerned. And now, for the first time in this cycle, you might have greater enthusiasm on the Democratic side than on the Republican side. At least, coming into the Democratic convention, we're seeing sort of this Harris honeymoon polling bump. We'll see how long that lasts, but right now, I think without question, the race has been transformed.
I think it's again, I want to credit your note. I think this is where I saw it, but I think you said before 25% of voters had an unfavorable view of both Biden and Trump, and you called it an unpopularity contest, I think, in a podcast. Is that newfound popularity or momentum you're talking about, is it enough to tip towards, do you think, Kamala Harris, or do we have a neck and neck race?
It's pretty neck and neck. So that poll, 25% of Americans having an unfavorable view of both Biden and Trump. These are the so-called double haters. That's the highest metric in modern American history, and it's not particularly close. The only time it was even approaching 20% was in 2016, when that was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. And again, those numbers were also pre-assassination attempt. I think those numbers are now probably single digits, but it's really a story thus far of, previously a lot of sort of soft Democrats, even soft Nikki Haley voters from the primaries were voting for Biden because he wasn't Donald Trump, right? You're voting basically because you don't like the other candidate with even greater numbers. But now it's more of a positive vote for Harris. Again, we'll see, if this is a sprint versus a marathon. We'll see if that enthusiasm can continue. But all signs point to it continuing with, on the eve of the Democratic convention a couple weeks from now.
The news cycle in this time is insane. I mean, in terms of what happens, how quickly it happens, how things can happen. What are you going to be watching when you think out over the next few weeks and months? I mean, I'm sure there'll be lots of unexpected surprises, but what are going to be critical?
Yeah, well, one of the things we try to do at the Washington Research Group with TD Cowen is, what are the scheduled catalysts? Because to your point, so many things happen that aren't scheduled, but we see at least 4 big catalysts, in the next, call it 7 to 8 weeks. You have the Harris VP pick. That's probably number one. Number two will be the Democratic convention that begins in Chicago on August 19th. Sometime in September, probably the first half of September, we might have a presidential debate between Harris and Trump. Right now, that's probably either September 10th, that's the ABC News date, or perhaps September 17, 18, that's the Fox News date. And then a few days after that, September 18th, we, in theory, have former President Trump sentencing in a New York courthouse on those 34 felony counts. That's a little bit unclear given the Supreme Court's decision on the immunity case. It's already been delayed because of that. But those are kind of the big four that we're watching that are scheduled. And yes, the election day isn't until November 5th, but early voting begins in some places in mid-September. You know, as much as 80% of the vote might be cast by November 5th. So when you think about October surprises, in reality, it might be more of a September surprise this time around because so many states vote early and vote by mail now.
We heard, of course, that President Biden was looking to make some changes, a constitutional amendment with regards to presidential immunity. How does that play into this? Is this another X factor we have to watch?
I mean, I think it's a little bit underscored with the Harris campaign's freedom messaging, right? That's really kind of underlying both abortion rights as well as, democracy, et cetera. Long story short, a constitutional amendment is unbelievably difficult to get done. You need 2/3 of the vote in both the House and the Senate, as well as 3/4 of all state legislatures. So it's a long question, but I'll give you the short answer. It's almost impossible to get done.
And I want to shift gears a bit, though, as we think about the longer term implications of what happens in terms of who's elected, the makeup of Congress, and those types of things. So maybe let's start with, let's say that former President Trump wins the presidential election. And maybe you could take us through what we should think about in terms of if we get a Republican Congress or if we get a split Congress.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to frame the discussion. It's not just who wins the White House, but sort of the undercard here is the House and the Senate. So right now, the House is 51-49 Democratic controlled. The 435-member House, depending on the day, is a 2 or a 3 seat Republican majority. This is super important next year because you have the debt ceiling returning next summer. And then you have a $4.5 trillion tax and fiscal cliff next year with the expiration of all those 2017 individual tax cuts, as well as what are called the Obamacare subsidies. So, right now, President Trump has said he would want to extend all of those tax rates where they are, if not cut further. The presumptive nominee, Kamala Harris, we presume will continue Biden's campaign pledge of extending current rates for those making under $500,000. With a split Congress, Trump can't do anything, or Harris couldn't do anything unilaterally on tax policy. So a split Congress with the White House could mean a pretty messy year on tax and fiscal policy, probably without really knowing what's going to happen until, late December of next year.
Yeah, and I know that sometimes we hear from market strategists, they get more comfortable with split Congress because then less wild swings can happen in any one direction. But if we pull up your note, you mentioned about the 2017 tax cuts, but even on tariffs and immigration, I mean, a 10% tariff on all imports. Immediately, Canada's ears perk up and want to understand what that means, of course. 60% tariffs on China. And then I think there's an interesting thing he says, it says likely lower after negotiation. And then the deportation of almost, it says here, it could be up to 7 million undocumented immigrants. I mean, these are big, big shifts. I mean, how do you, when you're thinking about this, Chris, and working with your team, how do you price this in, like the probabilities of these things happening?
Well, look, I mean, we think particularly in a divided government situation, if we're in a world in which Trump has won, our expectation is he would probably lean in to the policies where he has near unilateral power in his authority as president of the United States. And two areas, unlike tax policy, are trade and immigration policies, where the office of president of the United States has pretty tremendous powers. Trump has been pretty clear on the trade front on two things. The first would be a 10% across the board tariff on all imported goods announced on day one. He can do that without Congress. Our expectation is that Canada would get a carve out in that, mainly because of USMCA, sort of one of the signature trade achievements of Trump's first term. USMCA review process is also underway with a deadline of July 1st, 2026. I want to be clear, though, there's no certainty that Canada and Mexico would get carve-outs on that 10% tariff. And then the second one on the trade front would be the repeal of permanent normal trade relations with China. That does require Congress, although the votes candidly are probably there. He could also institute the tariff changes unilaterally, and that would take the blended rate on Chinese, the blended tariff rate on Chinese imports from about 20% to 60%. And then you add in that 10. So you're talking, 20 to an increase of 20% tariffs to 70% tariffs.
I want to ask, and again, I apologize for the lack of time. Next time I'm going to get you here for an hour. We can talk longer. But would the expectation with a Democrat White House and a Democrat Congress, which I don't think is probably very likely, but it'd be more the same? Like there's no massive changes in policy direction.
I think that's right. You would probably, just because of the geography and the arithmetic in the Senate races, it's pretty hard to see how the Democrats could hold, but it's possible, but it's still going to be by the narrowest of margins. So you're probably talking something middle of the road on taxes, which candidly might cool down inflation, might calm the bond market a tiny bit. And also, if you have a Republican Senate with a Democratic president, the Senate confirms the cabinet and the regulators. So you kind of have a bit of a hedge there on policy. You don't have to worry too much about the inflationary aspects of tariffs, and certainly not the inflationary potential for a labor supply shock with the deportation efforts.
Chris, I've only got about 45 seconds. You mentioned Canada in terms of a carve out, one would hope, with USMCA. Anything else you think that from a Canadian perspective people should be watching?
I mean, I think that the USMCA review process will certainly be a big topic, regardless of election outcome, whether it's Harris, whether it's Trump. The real focus here isn't on Canada so much as Mexico. And the main issue with the USMCA review process is the perception that China is using Mexico to get around some of those tariffs via transshipment. So, all things being equal, Canada should be in a pretty good spot regardless. But we'll have to stay tuned.